Hello, everyone. Shalom Aleichem. I would say good morning, but I know not everybody it has morning right now. Just a reminder to please keep yourselves muted when you're not speaking, and also to try to turn off anything that could interrupt while you are speaking. So you may, as you're aware, there were supposed to be two panels, but Rachel Grossman, my namesake, no relation to my knowledge, had to, for personal reasons, can't attend. And the same applies, Perla Sneh was going to co-moderate, but that same thing happened to her, that personal matters preventing that. We're going to just dive right in. You can share questions through the chat, and I will read through those while people are speaking. And as you know, you have the yearbook for introductions. We're going to issue those today for sake of time. So our first talk is from Tamara Gleason, and it is titled Yiddish Usage as a Key Element in Early Commemoration Efforts in Mexico During the Holocaust. Go ahead, Tamara.
Hi, Shalom Aleichem. Thank you very much. I wanted to thank the organizers and also the chair and the moderator and the other participants who kind of like accepted me here in their panel, as I will be talking about the Jewish community in Mexico. It's not that far away, right, from Canada. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen, and the title of my presentation, it's like more specific, is A Brief to Abobe. In A Brief to Abobe in Poland, Children and the Reception of the Khurbn in Mexico. And I want to start with a quote. I'll be reading in Yiddish. The translations are mine, and I will accept any recommendations, any critiques. But I'll start. This is a text written by Rivke Krut, who was a student in the Erster Class Mittelschule. And this is Rivke Krut. A Besuch von Dr. Schoschkes. Heiligen Erev Pesach ist geworden Punkt 2 Jahre, wie es ist vorgekommen der Aufstand in Warschauer Ghetto. Das ist eine treuerige Date für uns Jiden. In dem bitteren Kampf sind umgekommen 40.000 hungrige und verpeinigte Jiden, Brüder und Schwestern von unserem Volk. Es ist Erev Pesach. Es ist Erev Pesach. In Saal stellt uns vor der Direktor Gast mit dem Namen Dr. Schoschkes. Der Gast, das mit seinen Augen gesehen, hat allein übergelebt die alle Peinen Jesurim, was die Nazis haben getan, die unsere Brüder und Schwestern und kleine Kinder. Schrecklich treurig seien gewesen die Gast. Ich habe gespürt, wie es nimmt mich herum, ein schrecklicher Weitag. Es hat sich mir in den Hals so ein Knäuel gestellt und ein Stromtränen hat sich ergossen getan von meinen Augen. Mein Herz hat geklemmt vor Weitag. Herrendig wie treurig hunderte Mames und Tates und Mames und Kinder sind in Lebendigkeit verbrennt geworden oder verschickt geworden in speziell Gaskammern. And after that, this is a kitzer from a whole text. And after that, she talks about the children in Medem Center who were killed and the teachers. And she finishes her writing with by talking about the significance of Warsaw Ghetto and what Warsaw Ghetto means, and talking as well about continuity, right? So I'm gonna just quote the last part of her writing. Soll der Kampf in der Warschauer Ghetto sein eine Lehre für die Völker von der Welt? As, trotzdem was, man hat uns physisch zerklappt, aber unser Geist, der jüdische Geist, lebt und wird leben. Wir, die glückliche, übergebliebene Jiden, wollen keinmal nicht vergessen die heiligen Helden, welche sind gefallen in Europa. Ehre sehr Andenk. And with that, she finishes this text. And what's interesting is that this text is actually published in a compilation of student writings, together with the texts that have to do with a visit to a nearby forest, or about Mexican history, and so on. So it's a compilation that talks about it's like a compilation of words selected by the teachers, because they are they are good writings and so on. And what is very surprising is that we find in these compilations a lot of writings by children about the Holocaust. So I'll read just for a bit. With this word, Yiddish Shul student Rivke Kruth described the emotions she felt upon hearing in an after-school talk Dr. Shoshke's account of the mass killing of Jews by the Nazis, as well as about Warsaw's ghetto uprising. Shoshkes, who had escaped the Warsaw Ghetto in 1939 after briefly serving in the Judenrat, was visiting the Jewish community in Mexico from New York and made a spontaneous visit to one of the Yiddish-speaking schools to talk to the children. From Rivke's account, we learn that owls did not shy away from telling students details about the Nazi atrocities against Jews in Europe, and that they also taught children about the Jewish resistance to the Nazis and what that meant for their own Jewish community in Mexico. And in this text, Rivke portrays how this news represented a national Jewish tragedy, prescribing the surviving Jewish communities with a mission of remembering the fallen Jews and ensuring cultural continuity. Shoshke's visit was indeed special for the students, as he had been in Warsaw's ghetto, a topic that these students have been studying before, and they have been learning about this topic since 1942 at least. So now I will talk a little bit about my research overall. I'll talk a little bit about the historiography. Of course, this paper fits very well into Cesarani's and Sundquist and Diner's, that we all know very well these works and this myth of silence and the importance of looking at Yiddish sources. And Diner has talked about the importance of the Holocaust in youth movements and schools, and toward a little bit by the end of the Holocaust and in the post-war period. And Nomi has an amazing chapter that talks about the stories about the Holocaust for children. And Miriam Udel's presentations also goes very well with my presentation in explaining what were these writers doing and the stories they were writing for the children in the United States, and that we're traveling around, and we'll see an example of that. And also, but we don't have that many works on how the children were taking all these stories, how they were interpreting these stories, and what were they writing themselves. And I think the Mexican case is really interesting because we have two schools, and I'm going to get into that. We have like two schools that are teaching Yiddish on a daily basis, and it's one of the main languages of instruction. And for that, I think that a very interesting paper by Elizabeth Lorenz about American children writing in Yiddish and the Sholem Aleichem schools. But the difference with the Mexican context is that in Mexico, these were daily schools. It was not like a Zuntik school or an afternoon school. So I'll give you a little bit of context very, very quickly. This is like the Mexican synagogue in Mexico. Inaugurated in 1941. The Arona Kodesh is the same as in the synagogue that was in Shavel. And we have like around 12,000 to 16,000 Jews living there during the war period, mainly in Mexico. And we have the Jewish community in Mexico was very well informed about the Nazi atrocities. If we have a look at the Yiddish newspapers, the Stimme and Der Weg, we can see that they had very, very they knew very much what was happening, and they got a lot of news. Now, let's go to the network of Jewish schools in Mexico. So we have in 1924 the first Yiddish school. That's going to be the Yiddish Schule. It's quite diverse ideologically speaking. And in 1941, in the middle of the war, there's like a rupture. So we have the Yavne school, which was more religious, and we have the Tarbut school as well. Both are kind of like both separate from the Yiddish school. So we have 3 Yiddish schools in which students are learning in Yiddish about Yiddish literature, Yiddish history, Jewish religion, and so on. So it's like very, very intensive. Now, my sources for these are mainly like the Yiddish newspapers, where we have accounts of commemoration efforts, and the reports on Yiddish plays that the children were performing during the war period. We have Yiddish school journals, and I think that these are the most interesting source because they allow us to see how these children were kind of assimilating the news and writing about the Holocaust. They were actively being asked to write about the Holocaust, or they wanted to do that because of all the news they were getting. And the main problem that I have, and I will encourage any suggestions, is to distinguish like what is coming. It's very hard with education and with children to know what's coming from the school and or the parents' ideologies and what they are like bringing. So that's one point. And from my research, I have seen like well, I wanted to talk about three main things. So we have teaching the Khurbn in schools and non-formal education settings. What I have seen is, I'm going to talk about these three aspects, is teaching Yiddish and teaching the Khurbn, Yiddish in commemorative efforts, and Yiddish used to ensure Jewish continuity, and how is this going to be explained in the context of the Holocaust. So teaching Yiddish and teaching the Khurbn. So for that, it's very important to know that language the Yiddish was a language of instruction. It was the news in which it was the language in which they communicated the news about what was happening. And as we know, they were talking about gas chambers. They were talking about mass killings at school. The teachers were talking about this actively. And I think Miriam Model said like they didn't have the opportunity to shy away from those news. They were actively speaking about that. So what we have is that they also use the topic of the Holocaust to teach Yiddish per se. And I'm going to give you an example in a little bit. So so I'll give you the example for this. Here we have two different letters written by students to their bobe or their seide, to the grandpa or grandma. And what I think is these two letters were actually kind of like a grid, I don't know if you say that in English, that helped students to actually fill in the blanks and write their own letters. So we have the letter of Leah Elstein to her Bobe and of Asher Kogan. And it's basically explaining like, I don't know, like, I hope I will see you again. I miss you. I have heard these terrible news that are happening in Europe, and I hope everything's going to be fine. So in this sense, they are both teaching Yiddish and teaching Yiddish language and how to write properly. These are young students, and they are talking about what is happening in Europe at the same time. And the other thing I wanted to give you is an example of how teachers and activists both use resources produced elsewhere and also develop special activities to process with their students what was happening in Europe. So we have activities in which they are talking about the Holocaust, and we have the incorporation of other sources produced elsewhere. So for example, one thing I have found is this text by Gittele, and I'm going to read this. This is the translation of the text. So this is written in August 1943, and this is Gittele. And Gittele says, "Wir alle Kinder von dem 3. Klass haben bestimmt, nicht zu feiern kein Geburtstag, weil in Polen seien voran sehr sach jüdische Kinder, welche Hitler harget sie aus. Gittele Schapschiks Mame hat gebracht a Tort in Class zu ihr Yomtev." And then it starts talking about, I'm not going to be reading everything in Yiddish, but basically it says like the children came, we were celebrating the birthday of this girl, of Gittele, and then the teacher read us the story of Yosele. And after the story of Yosele, we voted and we decided we're not celebrating any more birthdays. So this was probably this whole idea of like the voting and so on was organized by the teacher and goes very well with the policy that the Central Committee in Mexico was establishing of not celebrating things because of the news that were happening in Europe. So I think this example tells you it's a very good example to see how stories produced elsewhere being incorporating in the teaching setting, and how the teacher develops certain strategies to talk about this topic, to involve and make the children engage and take decisions on how they wanted to react to this news. So this story by Yosele is a story that you can very well read in like a little bit of an explanation in Power Kadar's book. This was published only a month before this activity took place. So Yosele was published in Kinder's Journal in in July in 1943. And in August, the teacher was incorporating this story into the classroom and was using it and creating her own kind of like her own I don't know, her own activity to talk about the classroom. And I have seen as well a couple of stories produced in Mexico by activists. And for example, there's one story about the Medem. As soon as they got the news about the Medem sanatorium being and all the children being killed, one of the activists goes to they were having like a camp, a study abroad camp, and he came and read his own story. And this was later published in the newspaper, not in a kinder journal. So after that, I'll go to children and place. So another thing that I have found is like, of course, we know that Yiddish was the main language for commemorative efforts and protest meetings in the community. And we're gonna see that as well in the Jewish schools. And I don't know how, Jeffrey, can you tell me when I have like 2 minutes? I don't know, how long do I have? I forgot to time here now. Okay, so here we have a play called Noch ein Khurbn. And what I have seen is, of course, that the 3 different schools would have a complete different approach when it came to the ideologies and how they were interpreting the Holocaust. So, of course, this is this is a play in the Tarbutschule, which was Zionist, and the whole narrative of the play is going to be quite Zionist, like Noch ein Khurbn, what is happening now after the Holocaust and what we're going to be doing. But there were like very different plays. There's another play in Yavne that talks about how religious Jews, and this was written in Mexico by a Mexican Yiddishist, and how these news, how religious Jews actually took part in Warsaw Ghetto uprising. So we see theater plays, end of year ceremonies, and throughout the year, they are performed for these children are performing in Yiddish, and it's also a very good way to actually explain the parents and to tell the parent, to show the parents how much they are learning in the Yiddish classroom. So as I said, teachers and activist ideologies shape the materials and narratives of the commemoration. So, okay, great. I'm gonna go now to my last example that is about the use of Yiddish to ensure continuity. And this is going to be one topic that the children themselves are going to be writing about. So there is like this contest in which children are asked to talk about the Jewish future in Mexico, about the Jewish youth and Jewish future in Mexico. And we have here several responses from students. And one student actually links it to the Holocaust and tries to draw like a message from what is happening in Europe. And others will not refer to the Holocaust, but I'm going to bring an example here that does. So this is Toive Segal. And she kind of like very strongly condemned the parents speaking Spanish in the house and saying how that leads to assimilation. And she's going to be talking about how assimilation does not lead to less anti-Semitism, and it's going to use the example of the experiences of German Jews who had been assimilated. And now, well, I'll quote here. So it says, "Wir dürfen nicht vergessen," and I'm gonna, yeah, you can see the translation there. "Wir dürfen nicht vergessen, als die Jugend in Deutschland hat gelebt sehr gut und mit einmal ist alles zerstört geworden und die dosige junge Leid Leid toppel, weil sie weiß nicht, für was sie leid. Und das ist der Resultat von der falschen Erziehung, was sie haben bekommen." And we see this whole, like the argument of how it's very important not to assimilate because it's going to lead, it's not going to actually lead to improve the situation of Jews already before the war period. And we can see the children writing about this in the Sholem Aleichem books. Is that, shall I?
Can you finish up, Tamara?
Yes. So, yes, so I think that was about it. I wanted to give 3 very clear examples. The first one was how the topic of the Holocaust was discussed in Yiddish. Well, Khurbn was discussed in Yiddish, also as a means to teach Yiddish to the children. And because that was linked to the idea of one of the things that we can do is ensure Jewish continuity in Mexico. And the other point was that we have these transnational, well, these stories published in the United States that are being used in the Yiddish classroom to talk about the Khurbn and for children to process their feelings. And yeah, so I think I'll finish there.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Tamara. This is a really interesting paper, and I look forward to the Q&A when we'll have a chance to discuss it. So our next paper is from Jan Schwarz, who, even if we were doing introductions, would not need an introduction. Jan's going to speak today about Chava Rosenfarb's artistic journey from the Lodz Ghetto to post-war Montreal.
Thank you so much for this conference, which has been a delight. And I will just start my presentation. Let me begin with the earliest signposts on Chava Rosenfarb's artistic journey. Her literary compositions as a pupil in the Yiddish secular school, the Medem School in Lodz, her participation in the Yiddish writers group at the home of the Yiddish poet Miriam Ulinover in the Lodz Ghetto, which Rosenfarb described as the closest I've ever came to a class in creative writing. And most importantly, her relationship with the Yiddish poet Simcha Bunim Shaiwitz, whom she met in the Lodz Ghetto in late 1943. In an article, and you will see it here, here is a photograph of Shaiwitz.
I think you need to share your screen again, Jan.
Oh, okay. I'm not shared. Okay. Okay. Now it's shared, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So this is the quote I want to read here from an essay by Rosenfarb. Shaiwitz was my mentor and friend. Through all the post-war years, his spirit has seemed to hover over me, a powerful presence in my life as a writer. His poetic voice permeates my own poems and prose writings on the subject of the war. He himself, under a host of disguises, appears as a character in many of my stories. Even when I write on themes other than the Holocaust, he's somehow there with me, guiding me, forcing me to see present-day life through the prism of those earlier shattering experiences. In the Lodz Ghetto, Shaiwitz wrote the poems Lech Lecho and Frühling 1942, which he performed at Miriam Ulinover's literary salon. This became Rosenfarb's artistic model for Khurbn Yiddish. This is evident in a diary entry written in the Bergen-Belsen DP camp June 30th, 1945, where she characterized her vision for an epic work about the ghetto as a betrayal of the victims. To write such a novel would be an insult to my dear ones and also to myself. More than a quarter century later, in 1972, Rosenfarb gave a presentation at the Jewish Public Library in Montreal to celebrate the publication of her novel trilogy, Der Bäum von Leben, an epic work about the Lodz Ghetto. Rosenfarb's ambivalence about her trilogy, which had taken more than 20 years to write, is on full display. Was not the novel too elegant and too polished a literary form for such a story? Was it not too detached from any lived reality, too much a game of cleverly concocted plots? In writing a novel about the Holocaust, would I not end up by sitting against a reality that was impossible to encompass? Was I capable of recreating the specific atmosphere of those nightmarish days, assuming that it was possible to recreate it in the first place? As time went on, it became increasingly clear to me that no one, not even the most gifted writer, would be able to capture the true atmosphere of the ghetto. Even if the writer succeeded in writing a masterpiece, it could not be the real thing. In Rosenfarb's story, The Masterwork, which was published in English in 2012, a year after her death, the protagonist, the Yiddish teacher, Victor, has devoted decades of his life to write his magnum opus about his experiences in the Lodz ghetto. After his completion of the manuscript, it is destroyed in a fire that kills Victor. Deeply dissatisfied with the finished manuscript, Victor had also written a second version, which his wife Sonia managed to save. A year after Victor's death, ostensibly by suicide, Sonia decides to read this second and only remaining version of his masterpiece, masterwork. I quote, "The handwriting was unrecognizable and barely legible. It took her a while before she realized that the thousands of handwritten pages were full of thousands of nonsensical, disjointed paragraphs and meaningless scribbling without beginning or end, a hodgepodge, a mess, a diarrhea of phrases, a disgorging of words, a heap of garbage. She wondered if Victor had gone mad. This at least provided an explanation for his suicide at the cottage. His insanity had prompted him to destroy himself along with the sole copy of his earlier work, as well as the cottage where he, Sonia, and the children had spent the happiest moments of their lives." Rosenfarb's ambivalence about her trilogy as a betrayal of the Khurbn Yiddish of the survivors created during the war in the ghetto camps and in hiding is here given fictional representation as the meaningless scribbling of a madman and suicide whose literary legacy is compared to a heap of garbage. Second chapter. The other major influence on Rosenfarb's artistic journey was her childhood friend Zhenya Mashinkowska, who later married Per Larsen, a Swede, and became Zhenya Larsen, with whom she corresponded for almost 50 years. The Polish correspondence between Rosenfarb and Larsen will be published later this year in an English translation edited by Rosenfarb's daughter, Goldie Morgenthaler. It offers a unique view of the lives of two Jewish women writers who were working in two very different national, cultural, and literary contexts. The multilingualism of a Yiddish and a Swedish writer conducting their correspondence in Polish highlights the dispersion and ruptures that impacted the lives and literary careers of post-Holocaust survivor writers. This is, by the way, Larsen on the left and Rosenfarb on the right. And this is a photograph from the 70s taken in Stockholm. The two writers repeatedly complain about their lack of proficiency in Polish. As a graduate of the Polish school and a daughter of a Polish-speaking Jewish family, Zhenya never learned to write in Yiddish. In Zhenya's letter from August 6, 1968, she writes, "Polish is a dead language for me. With the exception of our letters, I never use it. And that is also the reason for my fears regarding our continued correspondence. Can one maintain a lively and meaningful contact when the language, the very words themselves elude us? What if our most important means of communication shrinks to almost nothing?" Unquote. The correspondence documents the two writers' post-war decades of trauma, recovery, and artistic creativity. It is a rich source for gender issues related to the lives of two women writers whose artistic careers were conducted in very male-dominated Yiddish and Swedish contexts. After their separation in Bergen-Belsen in April 1945, they don't see each other for more than 2 decades. Zhenya Mashinkowska came to Sweden as a refugee following her liberation from Bergen-Belsen in May 1945. She was admitted to an art school in Stockholm as a sculpturist. After marrying Per Larsson, she published a trilogy of Swedish documentary novels in the 1960s under the name Zhenja Larsson. The trilogy portrays her experiences in the Lodz ghetto, her stay in Bergen-Belsen DP camp, and her arrival in Sweden. In its scope and content, Larsson's trilogy is similar to A Tree of Life. And actually, the first volume will be published in a Polish translation in a few months. Larsson's work introduced a generation of Swedish readers to the genocide of the European Jews and to the challenges faced by refugees in adapting to their new country. Simultaneously with her career as a novelist and essayist, she worked as an acclaimed sculpturist. Letter from a New Reality included her own translation, with the help of her Swedish husband, of the Polish letters that she wrote to Rosenfarb. In her book, Larsson disguised the identity of Rosenfarb and her family by giving them Swedish and American names. The name changes were part of Larsson's strategy of domesticating the Polish Jewish world in order to make it more palatable to the Swedish readers. In contrast, writing in Yiddish for Jewish readership, Rosenfarb could fully express her Jewishness and explore uniquely Jewish issues of victimhood, collaboration, and resistance. This highlights the very dissimilar literary agendas of these two novelists, each of whom bore witness to the horrors of the Holocaust, but in two distinct voices and languages, Jewish and non-Jewish. The forthcoming publication of the correspondence includes both Rosenfarb and Larsson's letters and inserts the correct names. Only rarely do Larsson's letters address the experiences in the Lodz ghetto and Auschwitz that she shared with Rosenfarb. In one letter from 1962, she points out that they have never discussed their war experiences in their correspondence. But almost 2 decades after the war, quote, "It is perhaps time and the perspective sufficiently safe for us to have a conversation even about these things." In the same letter, Larsson reminds Rosenfarb of an incident in the Sassel labor camp in which a capo slapped Zhenja as the female inmates were scrambling for their ration of soup. Without stopping to think, Rosenfarb slapped the capo in retribution, an act of disobedience so significant that she could have been sent to the gas chambers along with the rest of her group. Instead, after a day's reflection, the capo relented. From then on, Rosenfarb, her mother, her sister Zhenja, and her stepmother each received an extra ration of soup every day. This incident inspired the most famous of Rosenfarb's stories, Edgar's Revenge from 1989, which is told from the point of view of Black Aurelia, which is a capo, who is a capo. Edgar's Revenge, the protagonist's name sharing the last syllable with Zhenja, addresses in fictional form the complex post-war relationship between Larsson and Rosenfarb, which is characterized by guilt, self-hatred, and competitiveness. In a 1962 letter, Larsson thanks Rosenfarb for enabling her to survive. That I could get out of this hell and continue to live and believe in the humanity in us must to a large part also be credited to you. The slap in the face, Eva, straightened my back and returned human dignity to me. Just then it helped me to persist. The correspondence between Larsson and Rosenfarb provides an intimate account of key moments of their lives in the Lodz ghetto and post-war period after Rosenfarb's immigration to Montreal in 1950. In a letter from Rosenfarb to Larsson from June 6, 1948, she gives a description of her encounter with Lodz, the only time she ever visited the city after the war. Quote, and here we have a photograph of the destroyed ghetto taken in June, August of 44. And this is the quote from the correspondence. The city of Lodz I found very changed. I couldn't recognize the streets I knew. They seemed smaller, narrower than before. I walked along my street, Jerem's Kiko, and stood for hours opposite our windows on the other side. Once I even had a moment of weakness, and Sasha was there to see it. I cried like a baby. I walked in the streets of the ghetto. Poles live there now, and their children play in the debris of the houses. On Baluchi Rünek, trade is flourishing as always, and on the smallest plaque anywhere to mark that this was once the ghetto. And not the smallest plaque anywhere to mark that this was once the ghetto. Soon no one will know, and who cares about it anyway? There was a pile of rubble where Schwarz once lived. I stopped there and felt as if I was standing over his grave. It is true, Zhenya, our Lodz, the city of our childhoods, does not exist any longer except inside us. The Lodz of today is a foreign city.
Hey, Yen, can you finish up soon?
Yeah. So, in conclusion, I want to just say, come with my conclusion here. And in conclusion, Rosenfarb's artistic journey and work is exemplary of the survivors and exiles who became the exponents of Yiddish post-war literature. The life writing and fiction based on her experience in the Lodz ghetto, Auschwitz, and Bergen-Belsen that she created drew its inspiration from the Khurbn Yiddish of Schwarz. However, it was her half-century-long correspondence in Polish with her childhood friend Zhenya Larson that enabled her to reflect year after year on her artistic journey and daily life in Yiddish, Polish, and English from the Lodz ghetto to Montreal. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Yen. Great talk. Really interesting material and discussion. Okay, well, we're going to move on now to Matthew Johnson, who will soon have something in the yearbook, but is currently graduated from got his doctorate at University of Chicago a couple of years ago and is now teaching in Lund, colleague of Jens. And Matthew is going to speak today. The title of his talk is, quote, "On the Loneliness of the Yiddish Writer," unquote, Chava Rosenfarb's Self-Translations.
Thank you very much. And thank you first to the organizers of the conference, which has been really incredibly enriching. It is, I recognize, a luxury to talk in this setting as such unbearable violence continues to unfold in Gaza and Ukraine and Sudan, and in the fresh memory of October 7th. But it is also a privilege to take part in a collective effort to listen and think with Yiddish perspectives in the Holocaust, a chorus of voices that was so often marginalized, disregarded, or left unheard. And this talk is in part about the implications of such marginalization for the Yiddish writer and about its affective dimensions, though the title of the talk, a quote from a text by Chava Rosenfarb, my main protagonist, like Yen, is perhaps misleadingly narrow. I do think this is a story about a sense of loneliness, but it's also a story of mourning and joy, love and anger, ambition and failure. And it's a story that continues to change as readers pick up and grapple with Yiddish texts anew, as this conference so powerfully demonstrates. So I will, like Yen, focus on the work of Chava Rosenfarb, and I'm likewise interested in her artistic journey, though from a somewhat different angle. So this talk has two parts. In the first, I will provide some background on Rosenfarb's ghetto poetry and their initial reception in the Yiddish-speaking world. In the interest of time, I'll primarily focus on Rosenfarb's early poetry, though I'll also allude to her later and better-known prose writing, which was written decades after the war, but which likewise engaged with her experiences in the Lodz ghetto and later in Auschwitz, Basel, and Bergen-Belsen. In the second part, I'll briefly sketch Rosenfarb's sense of the growing constraints of what it meant or what it felt like to write in Yiddish in the 1950s and after, and I will partially reconstruct and reflect on her initially failed efforts to find a translator and on her turn to self-translation. I'll highlight a few, not always consonant issues that I find interesting or that I think touch upon some of the larger themes of this conference. But the talk as a whole is motivated by the idea that the trajectory of Rosenfarb's poetry, that following the course of that poetry as it morphed over time in diverse spaces and across languages, can open up important perspectives not only on Rosenfarb's life and work, but also on the emergence and development of what is now often called Holocaust literature in Yiddish, English, and beyond. So Rosenfarb began to write when she was already very young, but in her own accounts, as Jan mentioned, she only began to write seriously in the Lodz ghetto, where she was interred when she was still a teenager and where she came under the mentorship of Yiddish language poets like Shayevich and found an active group of writers who had fallen under the spell of an epidemic of writing, as she later phrased it. The manuscripts of her handwritten poems were stolen from her and presumably destroyed when she was deported to Auschwitz in 1944. Soon thereafter, she was transferred to Zazel, where she found a pencil, as she later recounts, and began to rewrite some of her ghetto poetry from memory, apparently on the ceiling above her bunk. Some of these poems made their way into her first books, which were published in London and Montreal in 1947. I won't dwell on this too long, but I think the practice of remembering and then rewriting poetry is worth further reflection, not least because it both highlights the importance of chronology, of the distinction between literature written while the war was ongoing and literature written after, a distinction that has been emphasized by David Roskis as well as by Sven Erik Rose and Sam Casso, among others. But this practice of remembering the poetry that was originally written in the ghetto also arguably complicates a strictly chronological demarcation and differs, I think, from other acts of post-war revision, rewriting, or translation. It's different, for example, from the cases of Elie Wiesel or Shaya Spiegel that have been analyzed by Nomi Seidman and Sven Erik Rose, respectively. And it's different from what I just learned from Katarzyna Persson about the translations of the Underground Archive of the Warsaw Ghetto. It's also interesting that Rosenfarb emphasizes in print, in the books that she published in 1947, that the poems were imperfectly remembered, nit genaue der Mond, even as she marks their date of creation. The quote here also notes the linguistic characteristics of these early volumes, especially the poem From the Depths, which I just note in anticipation of Hanna Pauline Galai's forthcoming book, which I'm very much looking forward to reading to learn more about how Rosenfarb thought about and experimented with Khurbn Yiddish. But in addition to the linguistic characteristics of From the Depths, which was written in Brussels in 1946, I would also highlight how that poem thematizes the trajectory of verse, the unwieldy path that a poem often takes, figured in the poem as song, as breath, and as a holy melody, a heiliger Nigen, that rises, to quote from Pauline Galai's recent translation, from a rotted paper here in the Father's pocket left behind, and that rises with joy, with love from dust, and as it's apostrophized from the depths, and over graves you climb above. Here I want to suggest that as readers, we might likewise follow the rise, or perhaps the rise and fall along pressurized paths of Rosenfarb's writing to retrace the trajectory that her writing took, and to suggest that in our reading of such poems, we should take into account their instability and multiplicity, in their composition and seizure, in their imperfect remembering, and later on in translation. In the initial post-war years, while Rosenfarb was still living as a displaced person in Europe, Rosenfarb found committed and often enthusiastic readers. In her archive, one can find, for example, letters from Aleph Lealis, in which he addresses her as a colleague, as a Kollegedichter, and as a Landsmann, offering praise of her work and material support on behalf of the Yiddish Pen Club. Avrom Rezen likewise praised her work as it sanctified and immortalized the dead. And there's much more that can be said about these early letters, which supported her early poetry, including interesting remarks by Lealis and Opatoshu about the eroticism of Rosenfarb's ghetto writing, which in their view was missing from most other writing by survivors. But I'll leave that aside for now. After her immigration to Montreal in 1950, Rosenfarb likewise found a group of supporters in a vibrant Yiddish cultural scene that has been illuminated by participants of this conference, including Rivka Margolis and Yen. At a local level, Rosenfarb was an active speaker in Montreal, and on a global scale, her writing circulated between transnational interconnected Yiddish communities, a cultural map that Yen has sketched in his book, Survivors and Exiles. I'm going to skip this, but this is a really interesting, just thinking about the presentations of Anne-Christine Klotz and Sam Spinner. She also contributed a text to a monument that was put up by the Lotzer Verband in Montreal, which I could talk about more later if you're interested. But while Rosenfarb participated in this vibrant cultural scene in Montreal, she wrote numerous texts that express a sense of constriction about Yiddish culture during the 1950s and after. And that often evinces a strikingly negative view of the conditions of the Yiddish writer, especially in the late 1950s and 1960s. And after, to cite just one of these texts, which she wrote in 1971 to introduce a collection of poems that she had self-translated, but which would not be published until 2013, when her daughter Goldie Morgenthaler included some of them in the volume Exile at Last. Rosenfarb writes in English, urged on by the desire to communicate, I have written this introduction as well as this collection of poems, and I have translated them into English. I won't read the whole quote in the interest of time, but there's an interesting also universal longing that's expressed in this introduction. While it's an introduction, a pained introduction that underscores not her sense of community, but rather her sense of solitude. And despite numerous other statements in which Rosenfarb insists on her identity as a Yiddish writer, primarily, there is here this expression of a kind of universalizing longing on what might be called a desire to be worlded to draw on Saul Zaret's work. Interestingly, such a universalizing gesture can also be found in a different form in the introduction to this early kind of collection of her ghetto poetry, in which she addresses in Yiddish both a non-Jewish and Jewish readership, und ihr von andere Völker und ihr unsere eigene Brüder, writing in 1947 that, quote, our children and the children of other peoples must sing the song of the great forest. So it's just interesting that it seems that even in the 1940s, she was imagining her work perhaps in translation, or at least for some kind of larger audience. Despite, I'm going to skip that. Despite this desire to be worlded, Rosenfarb continually came up against the indifference of the world. In her initial attempts to reach an English language audience, which began at least as early as 1959, Rosenfarb reached out to translators, including the well-known translator Maurice Samuel. I'm just going to note that these entreaties were consistently unsuccessful in these early years, but they also contain really interesting information about the conditions of Yiddish translation, of finding a translator during this period, and also about the ways in which gender shaped the ways in which Rosenfarb was received or not received. Several other translators likewise declined Rosenfarb's requests, which led her sometime, it seems, between 1959 and 1961 to begin self-translating her work, much earlier than is usually acknowledged in the existing scholarship. At YIVO, for example, I recently came across her translation of the early post-war poem, Das Lied von dem Jiddischen Kellner of Rom, which she called the Matseva, to again connect with Sam's talk. And it seems that she sent this translation out to several literary figures and publishers, though with consistently negative feedback. And there's a whole kind of archive, a whole stash of rejection letters in her archive in Toronto that are very depressing to read, but that also give a kind of record of how Holocaust literature by survivors, how Yiddish literature was perceived, assessed, judged, dismissed by North American publishers and translators. Only one of her, she also has an interesting letter with Bashevis, who not surprisingly insists on the necessity of translation, and really only one of her poems makes it into English during this period in 1965, the poem Loeb. There's also an interesting history in Israel that I'll leave out in the interest of time, but she has a little bit more success, especially with Habima, but she also meets a lot of resistance and frustration in Israel and among Hebrew language presses and translators. But in these concluding minutes, 2 minutes, I think, I want to return to the ghetto poems that Rosenfarb remembered after the war. These poems did not circulate beyond Yiddish until the publication of Exile at Last in 2013, and for decades they remained as English language poems in the desk drawer or in the mailboxes of largely disinterested publishers. But these self-translations are not only significant insofar as they reveal how Rosenfarb's writing did and did not circulate in the post-war decades, something that is in itself important for how we understand her place within the larger landscape of Holocaust literature. But they're also important because they reveal how she continued to think with and against these poems long after she initially remembered and rewrote them. In comparing the Yiddish and English versions, one can find significant excisions and emendations, as well as smaller shifts that are nonetheless telling. To cite just one example, the poem Wieglied or Lullaby, which was originally written during the liquidation of the Lodz Ghetto in 1944. This is a poem that Rosenfarb reworked at least twice in unpublished translations. They're both undated, I believe. This is likely from the early 1970s. You can see how intensively she was revising this translation into English. And then again, undated, but I believe from around 1996, where she again is translating this poem. And that eventually makes into print in Exile at Last. This is only one very small example that I'll just leave here for you to read while I conclude. But you can see there's a temporal shift from graves to future. And this shift in temporality, this insistence on a kind of futural perspective, albeit a very negative and despairing one, is something that you see in other of her self-translations, where over time she's also changing the temporal kind of constitution of these poems themselves. Another very sad but also quite interesting addition in her revision is from the Unser Gewehen, like our lament, becomes voiceless, silent, unuttered, and unheard in English, which is hard not to read it as an allegory of her own kind of sense of her status, at least in the English-speaking world in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and beyond. There's a lot more to be said about all of this, of course. I'm just going to conclude, though, by noting that the situation has changed, but also I want to, just very quickly, I think also the reason this is significant is because Jen brought up Der Bäum von Leben and like other texts, I mean, and the correspondence with Daniel Larsson. You see in these texts that she's grappling with similar issues. I mean, Der Bäum von Leben also begins in the preface, which is left out of the English, interestingly, with a kind of spectral colloquy between a Shayevich figure and the figure of the Yiddish writer, which is precisely about time and about the temporal kind of framing of their work, whether it's about the past, about the present, or about the future. And I think you see how these poems and the self-translations are also can reflect on her larger prose works that she's producing in Yiddish after the war. But to conclude, I'll just say that the situation is changing quite dramatically in the 1990s and 2000s, when much of her work has now become available in English, as well as in other languages. And so I just will end by saying that this story has not yet come to an end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. That's a really fascinating, actually, for many reasons. And it's also interesting that the connections and differences and emphases in Jen and Matthew's talks, both where there's continuity and where there are differences. There are a number of questions in the chat, and just a reminder to both audiences, you can submit questions in the chat or also orally. We have about 18 minutes left. I think I'm going to initially go with, I'm going to ask people who wrote into the chat but are still present to maybe ask the question out loud, but I'll call on you individually. And so the first question in the chat was from David. David, if you'd be willing to, or do you want me to read it?
No, it's fine. Tamara answered the question. My question to you, Tamara, was whether the other two schools also had Khurbn as part of their curriculum. And then you went on to answer it.
Yes, so yeah, okay, yeah, they were both teaching Yiddish Yafne and Tarbut, and the children in Tarbut were performing both in Yiddish and in Hebrew. So they will be performing like plays that have more to do with the establishment of the state of the founding of the state of Israel in Hebrew, but they will also be performing in Yiddish. It was by the mid-50s when they ceased to teach Yiddish in Tarbut, and in Yafne, of course. There is an issue with sources because the Yiddish Shul was very good at publishing the students' works. So I have many more sources about how children in the Yiddish Shul were writing about the Holocaust. But by looking at the press, it's very clear that the students in Yafne and in the Tarbut were talking about that topic.
Okay, great. And to stay for another minute with Tamara, Joel, you had a question about the plays. Did you want to elaborate? Or
Yes, thanks. And Sonia also did. I was really interested in your sort of brief discussion of the plays and just inviting you to expand on that. Interested more about the repertoire. Were they sort of adapting things that were written elsewhere, like you were talking about with other kinds of material? Can you tell us? I know this is very general, but sort of
yes, sure. So these performances, well, the children were performing, and they were mainly written. The ones about the Holocaust were mainly written by important Yiddish writers in Mexico. So two of them are written by Yankov Lantz. So even like the one the one that is Mi Kamoch is Israel, it's in Yiddish, and it's about how religious groups are also taking part of Warsaw Ghetto uprising. And the other plays, some of them are written by Alifas, who was a very important activist. He was a Zionist, the founder of Tarbut. And regarding Sonia's question, thank you very much, Sonia, for your question. So
Could I pose the question?
Sorry?
yeah, go. Yeah, well, let's have Sonia introduce her questions related.
Okay, yes. So thank you also everyone for this fantastic panel. So my question was, since Khurbn is a children's play about the Holocaust, to what extent does it reveal the amount of information about the atrocities themselves that was considered appropriate both to inform children about and also for people, specifically children, to depict on stage for an audience?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question because the whole topic of what can we perform, what we cannot perform, and so on. So what I have been able to access is I don't have the theater plays themselves. I went through the press and I look at the summaries at the recensies. I don't know how you say that. And so I was looking at these things, and then I can have a sense of what it is. Khurbn is more about like what happens with the liberation and the DP camps and the pogroms, but there's one that is Khurbn von Warschauer Ghetto. And in Khurbn von Warschauer Ghetto, I'll tell you very quickly what are the different scenes. And one is Kinder in Ghetto, Mame sucht ihr Kind, zu der Arcade, Zwei Yesomim, verlosene Kinder, Mutterrochels Gewein. And they were like literally talking about children being killed and so on. I don't think like it's, the theater plays do not allow us to see how much they were talking about the Holocaust, but definitely the children's writings themselves. These children are writing about gas chambers, they're writing about massive killings, they are writing about children being orphaned and about whole communities being completely destroyed. I cannot say in the theater plays themselves. It will be amazing to be able to access the scripts themselves, but that's not something I have been able to find yet. But it will be interesting to see, of course, more what was itself like performed and portrayed and so on. But yeah, and very quickly to Malena Chinsky's question, we do see a lot of different travelers. Yankov Pat goes and gives a speech, and parents are invited. Parents are requested to bring their children along. And we have Ephraim Oshri, and they are definitely some of them are doing fundraising, and definitely their visits kind of like help with the commemorative efforts and so on. Although, yeah. So I
Okay.
think, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, we're going to try to move on just because there's lots of questions and we're not going to have time for all of them, unfortunately. I'm going to both insert my prerogative as moderator to ask one quick question for both Yen and Matthew that maybe they can both respond to. And then there's other questions in there to bring up. So my question is, I'll mention two of these. So my question is, Yen, you stressed the value for Rosenfarb of writing in Yiddish, in contrast with Larson in the sense of freedom. And I mean, this is a well-known phenomenon, right? But you're applying it, looking at it in the specific case of the Khurbn. I mean, in Yiddish, in older texts as well. And Matthew, you emphasized the translating into English and that you wanted an English language audience. And so I'm wondering if the two of you could respond to that thought and reflect on it, the significance of it. And then there are a couple of people who've been asking about the response by Glanslelis, and I've forgotten now, Matthew, whether you said it was who the second poet was, but the positive responses to Rosenfarb's eroticism. And also, was this, what was this about? Was it Raisin, the other? Was it Avram Raisin? And then is there a change in the reception by a poet like Leilis, who, as I think it was Sonia brought up in her Q&A, in the that he was very critical of Frau Stock in 1919. What accounts for the difference in the response to Rosenfarb? Is it her artistry? Is it him softening, becoming less curmudgeonly, and others? So those are questions out there. There are plenty more, but I'll let you guys respond for now. And maybe Yen wants to respond to that second one as well.
Okay, let me just say one thing. Let me get to your answer kind of from a sideway in. And that is, Chava Rosenfarb is a very unusual Yiddish writer in the post-Holocaust period, in general, not only in the post-Holocaust period, because she wrote these massive novels and she never really attempted to serialize anything. That was the common procedure, that you wrote a novel, you serialized it in the Yiddish press. I've come across, I think, one work that was, she started to serialize and then she was not very happy with the way it was actually published in the newspaper, so she retracted it. But basically what she did was kind of like a very non-Yiddish approach to publication, because she wrote these long novels and then she brought them out directly in book form. And there was no, except for the short stories. The short stories she published in the Golden Decade. And that was, and I, in many ways, I think the short stories are in terms of her prose work, it's some of the best prose work she ever did. So my answer to this, your question, is that this is something I want to investigate more. I mean, das Polnische Judentum would have been a perfect place for her to place her collections of poetry in the 50s, 40s and 50s, right? But she didn't do that. She wanted to go her own way, and she didn't think about her work as part of that endeavor. It's a very interesting question. Maybe it had to do with that she was kind of, she was in Montreal, which was kind of on not New York, and maybe that played into this. But it's a very, I think it's a very interesting, there's no ever any question about that Yiddish is her language. I mean, she never, until very late in life, started to write directly in English. Right. And the translation was always done in collaboration with her daughter, Goldie Morgenthaler. Right. And that's from the beginning. And that also applies to her essays. So, yeah.
Matthew, any thoughts about either question?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I don't disagree with anything that Yen is saying. I mean, I think it's absolutely true that Rosenfarb was primarily identified as a Yiddish writer. At the same time, there was this very kind of long effort to reach a readership in English. That doesn't mean that she identified as an English writer, but this became very important, not just to her, but to other writers' work. I also would echo that she I do think that the self-translations begin much earlier. Like it's absolutely the case that Goldie Morgenthaler is crucial, like is essential for how her work becomes so widely disseminated in the 90s and 2000s. But a lot of the early stuff that I'm pointing to in this talk is actually before that collaboration becomes kind of central, and it doesn't quite work. That's also, you know, part of the story. I think there's a lot more that can be learned from her archive. I just have only looked at a few of the letters from these early 40s years, from the immediate post-war years. There's quite a lot there. She was clearly keyed into some kind of transnational network, like poets like Leilis, who were providing material support, help in getting published. Her publisher is what helps her actually immigrate to Montreal in the first place. But she's always, she's kind of she stands somewhat apart from a lot of the developments of Yiddish literature in the following decades. And there's a really interesting, very problematic review by Yankov Gladstein of her collection, Reus von Gan Eden, in the 60s, where he basically says that she's completely separate from Yiddish poetry, that she doesn't seem to be reading any modern Yiddish poetry. There's a lot to be said. Just like to not take up too much time on Leilis. The letters are extremely interesting, in part because there's like a strong undercurrent of sexism and chauvinism and flirtation. And the gender dynamics of the correspondence are obvious and something that I don't have her responses, but it's clear that she's also writing some very critical letters in response, but also that this is important for how she's being received as a poet. There's also something important about that, how she's getting published. And so my sense of the story is very complicated, and we have much more to learn about it. I'll just keep it at that.
It might be interesting to publish those exchanges. So another question, and again, I'm sort of running through the chat, but Jovita asks whether the Boim von Leben, she says she was simultaneously living in Lodz and Montreal. Did that play into the issue of temporality in her work? And maybe either Jan or Matthew could respond to that. It was directed Matthew, but either one of you, because Matthew brought up the whole thing about the temporality and what it accounts for that.
Well, there is a very interesting letter. I mean, there are many interesting letters in this correspondence, which is really a huge scoop. And we have something to look forward to when it's published later this year. But I mean, one of the letters, she says that, I've been working on this trilogy, the Boim von Leben, for all these years. And now it's taking on the character of my relationships with friends and family in Montreal. I mean, it's not about, it's actually more about that than it's about the Lodz ghetto. The setting is the Lodz ghetto, but all of these conflicts are informed by her relationships in Montreal. And she acknowledges that in one of her letters, I think from the 60s. So I think it's a very interesting thing for, this is an example of a post-Holocaust writer who is trying to shape this enormous work, right? And also at the same time commemorate. I mean, this is also one of the monuments. I mean, this was clearly a monument. I mean, if there is such a thing, to write a 1,000-page trilogy is the ultimate monument, literary monument.
Okay, great. Matthew, did you want to say anything to this question, or?
I think it's a really good question. I think I'll just say there's again, like you see also the shift I think Jan's also pointing to, and like her the short stories, for example, which come a bit later, are so much about life in Canada, in the postscript, as Goldie Morgenthaler has phrased it. I think what's also just really, I think, on this issue, the preface, the kind of to Der Boim von Leben in Yiddish, which is not in the English version, is really kind of meta literary, and includes a really interesting, this kind of spectral dialogue, which I briefly mentioned, between a kind of Shayevich-like figure and a Rosenfarb-like figure. And it really hinges on what it means. Like, are we living in Nechten? Are we living in the past? Are we living today or in the future? And it's a really pained, complicated kind of imagined conversation that also echoes things that you can find, as Jens mentioning, in the correspondence with Larson.
Yeah, okay. So I'm gonna summarize two last questions. One was from, if I can find it, from Milena for Tammy about Shoshka's visit. Was it representative of a wider phenomenon of reception of illustrious gifts and survivor travelers as a means of reinforcing memorial work in Mexico? And bringing Hannah's question for Jan about the relation.
No, it's okay. I don't waste time on my questions. I have to talk to Rose and Purvis later. Don't worry about me.
That was an interesting question, though.
I'll talk about the clear tensions later. Don't worry. Yeah.
Okay, it's an interesting question. So Jan, take a look at it in chat.
It's a little inside baseball, perhaps. So we get that.
Okay. So Tamara, do you want to respond to that about the representatives coming to Mexico, survivors or other illustrious people coming to speak about,
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Malena. Yes, definitely. I think like there are several of them. It's interesting because I'm not all of them travel to Mexico with the explicit purpose of actually reinforcing like a memorialization and so on. That travel from Shoshka's was because he was a translation of his book was going to be published in Spanish, so it had to be with that. And he of course went to the Jewish community. He was one of the correspondents of Der Weg, so he was publishing in Der Weg and so on. But yes, of course, you have also the visit of survivor Rabbi Ephraim Oshri, and you have Yankev Glant, Yankev Pat, visiting as well. So you have different survivors who are visiting, and definitely they reinforce the memorialization of the Holocaust. And just very quickly to Hannah Pauline's question, there was no need to talk about the Khurbn in Spanish because all the children in these schools had to know Yiddish. There is the one reference that like in the newspapers, that the Spanish-speaking teachers, because those lessons that they had to take according to the government were in Spanish, like science and Mexican history and so on. There are a couple of acknowledgements that the Christian teachers are actually kind of like mourning with us and are doing something, but mainly all the Jewish lessons and all the Jewish materials were in Yiddish. So that makes the Mexican case quite different from other places.
Great, thank you. Jeffrey, you want to say any last word?
Yeah, so first, just to thank once again all three panelists for really, really interesting and important papers. And this is great material and very interesting the way it's presented. I'm going to just draw attention to the fact that in the chat, Hannah posted a series of questions at the very bottom for the meta discussion later. And you might want to download those or copy them for the closing discussion, I mean to say. And otherwise, I'm going to end now so that we can begin punctually with the next panel and everybody can have a few minutes break. But again, thank you to Tamara, Matthew, and Jan for a really exciting panel to start the day.
Beautiful panel and wonderful job leading the way, Jeffrey. We'll see everyone in 15 minutes.